There we are. Okay, well, welcome. Thank you, Ron, so much for doing this, and also for Dave for organizing it. I really appreciate it as we get Idaho AEP growing, and these technical topics are great. So thank you. I'll let you take it away.
All right, Carrie, let me see if I can share screen. So please let me know if you see my screen here.
Beautiful.
Okay, you see it? Good.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, go ahead and get started. Ron Gestler here, Geosyntech Consultants. I've had 9 years almost, closing in rapidly on 9 years with Geosyntech. Came on board specifically to help establish our phytoremediation, phytotechnologies practice group. All in and going on almost 25 years of remediation consulting, and the vast majority of that has been primarily or at least partially focused on phytoremediation and phytotechnologies. My background is plant microbiology, so it's tends to be a good fit for this line of work. So pleased to be here today, and pleased to present my presentation titled Engineered Phytoremediation of Contaminated Aquifers or Contaminated Sites, Adapting a Natural System to Meet Remedial Goals. I'll be talking about more than just contaminated aquifers, though, today, but certainly getting into groundwater. So I wanted to start with a little bit of background on phytoremediation and phytotechnologies, realizing that a lot of folks may not have that keen of an idea of just what these technologies are. So first, what is phytoremediation? I love this simple definition. It is the use of plants to degrade or contain contaminants from groundwater, soil, sediments, and surface water. And so it begs the question, what type of environmental pollutants might we apply this to? My answer is it's really across the array of contaminants that we encounter at our sites. Certainly organics such as petroleum hydrocarbons and chlorinated solvents, but as well some of the inorganic pollutants such as metals, metalloids, think zinc, cadmium, arsenic, nutrients can align beautifully, nitrate, ammonium, sulfate, into the more recalcitrant compounds that we may encounter such as MTBE, the fuel additive, and then into some of the contaminants of emerging concern. Certainly 1,4-dioxane and 1,2,3-trichloropropane are two that I'll actually be speaking on in this presentation. So it's really across the spectrum of environmental pollutants that we have the potential to effectively apply phytoremediation. So then why use it? What are some of the key benefits here? For me, this is the essence of green and sustainable remediation, especially when compared to more conventional treatment technologies like ISB or ISCO and ISCR technology, and certainly pump and treat or dig and haul approaches, much more green and sustainable. Cost, there's a big benefit typically to this approach. Phytoremediation tends to cost typically 10 to 50% of the cost of more conventional treatment technologies. So it can be a very cost-effective approach. And we should be clear here. This is not, as some people have said in the past, isn't this a more emerging remediation technology? Not at all. Not at all. We have many decades of real-world experience applying this. So it's got a proven long-term track record of effectiveness when these phytoremediation systems are designed and implemented and monitored correctly. Additionally, they look good. They're aesthetically pleasing, and we get good community acceptance from them. I'm pleased to say that they're well accepted by the regulatory community, including US EPA. And at the end of the day, they're what we need them to be. They're an effective strategy for addressing contaminated sites by reducing contaminant mass, that is, treating the contaminant mass, and preventing the migration of contaminants, especially if it's a groundwater plume. So some phytoremediation 101 here, just to dig a little bit deeper into some of the key mechanisms that are involved in phytoremediation. This is hardly an exhaustive list, but these are the distilled down, these are the 6 or 7 key mechanisms that typically are involved in phytoremediation, often in working collaboratively with different elements. So let's start in no particular order. Phytostabilization. This is simply the sequestration or immobilization of a contaminant within the root zone, where it's immobilized. This is particularly true for things like metals, where they may be very mobile in a reduced form, but once they migrate to the root zone of a plant, which is very oxidizing, because where roots go, oxygen follows, you may find that you have immobilized it by transforming that contaminant into an oxidized form that is stable and won't migrate. Rhizodegradation, really one of the key mechanisms for most of our applications. Rhizo is Latin for root. So the rhizosphere is that area around plant roots that's critical. What do we see around plant roots? We see a proliferation of microbial communities. Bacteria and fungi, we typically see anywhere from 10 to as much as 1,000-fold higher cell densities in the rhizosphere around the root than we do in the surrounding bulk soil. That's because plant roots actively secrete root exudates through their roots that encourage the proliferation of fungi and bacteria. And as a result, those communities are there, often primed and ready to carry out biodegradation of our pollutants. This is especially true for things like petroleum hydrocarbons. Phytohydraulics, just a fancy way of saying the uptake of groundwater by plant roots, the process we call transpiration. This is critical for our groundwater impacted sites. We typically want to see hydraulic control brought about by the phytosystem. So this is where phytohydraulics comes into play. The plants, typically trees, are rooted down to the target groundwater. Once they get established, if you design a system correctly, you're going to obtain hydraulic control. Phytoextraction. This is the uptake of the target contaminant into the plant, where it may be destroyed within the plant to some degree. It may simply be held there. A great example of this are the nutrient sites. We here at Geosyntec have multiple sites where we're applying. We have applied or will be applying next year phytoremediation to address nitrate and ammonium contamination. It's simply fertilizer for these plants. Similarly, sulfate would be another great example where your contaminant is actually a nutrient for the plant. So it's taken up by the plant to support its growth. Phytoextraction. Phytodegradation. This is especially true for things like petroleum hydrocarbons, some of the chlorinated solvents, where we get uptake of the pollutant and subsequently it's broken down within the plant tissues of the plant. Phytodegradation. And lastly, another important one, phytovolatilization. So this is the uptake of a pollutant by the plant. It moves through the plant's vascular system and is released to atmosphere at the leaf surface. The process we call transpiration here, where it is then acted upon by either UV light or hydroxyl radicals in the atmosphere. A wonderful example of this is 1,4-dioxane that I'll speak about a little later. 1,4-dioxane has a very long half-life in the subsurface because it's so recalcitrant, whereas in atmosphere, typical half-life is 10 hours to 24 hours due to hydroxyl radicals, where it's quickly broken down. So phytovolatilization. So critically then, you have to understand it's often a combination of these mechanisms working together in concert that brings about the full remediation that we desire for these sites. So now that I've given you that little overview, I want to really emphasize one aspect of phytoremediation and plants in general. Much like we humans and many other animals, there is a plant microbiome. Just as we have a gut microbiome that's highly complex, so do plants have a plant microbiome. This is the microbial community that's growing on and inside of plants, both the roots, the above ground tissues, and within the plant's tissues itself. So it's a very highly complicated, complex community with really an elegant symbiotic relationship where the plant gives something to the microbes give something back to the plant, and they both benefit. And we often bring that to bear then on our phytoremediation sites. And this has really been an area of intense focus in the last 20 years. Plant-associated microbial communities, and what is their role in phytoremediation and effective of phytoremediation? Well, we know that in general, these microbial communities aid plant growth by helping the plant to acquire nutrients, things like iron and phosphate, as well as obtaining moisture from the soil matrix. Critically, they can confer resistance to some stresses, such as drought stress or excess salinity. And of course, some of them fix nitrogen. Most of you probably heard things like soybean and alfalfa have root nodules. These are diazotrophic, that is nitrogen-fixing bacteria that are associated there. Give the plant nitrogen, in exchange, the plant gives those bacteria a place to live and substrates to grow upon. So we know that these plant-associated microbes can play a significant role then in the contaminant degradation of some phytosystems. That's particularly true for things like petroleum hydrocarbons, some of the chlorinated solvents like trichloroethene, and a number of other target contaminants we may apply this to. And lastly, one of the big benefits, again, is the ability of certain microbes to actually reduce plant stress that may be associated with high contaminant levels or high salinity. This has especially been an area of focus in the last about 10 years of plant microbiology. How can we harness that relationship to get more effective phytoremediation outcomes? And so finally, one last thing to mention here is a group of bacteria within that community we call the plant growth promoting bacteria. This is a subset of that microbial community that we know directly benefits the plants. And one particular group of that then are what we call endophytes. And a lot of research has gone into this community lately. These are the microbes that live within the plant tissues themselves. Can assist the plant with, again, suppressing stresses, the response to stress from whether it be drought or salt, and can directly aid the plant in degrading contamination within the plant tissues. That's particularly true for things like petroleum hydrocarbons and some of the chlorinated solvents. And so we here at Geosyntec, as well as some other practitioners, are actively now engaged in the use of specific microbial cultures to enhance the phytoremedial outcome of some of our systems. For example, petroleum hydrocarbon sites, we may augment the microbial community with bacteria that we know can assist in degradation to aid the overall outcome and effectiveness of that system. And so then, once you now have a little sense for Phytoremediation 101, let me give a broad overview of the two general approaches that we take to apply phytoremediation to contaminated sites. So there's a traditional, or sometimes called conventional or non-engineered approach. This is typically a surface planting of a tree or some other type of plant to treat impacted soil and or groundwater. We contrast that and compare it to engineered or constructed phytoremediation systems. These are designed and constructed systems that manage plant growth, overcome challenging site conditions, and critically, oftentimes will directly target the zone for remedial effect. And a good example of that is the tree well system that I'll be speaking about a little later, a technology that I've worked with now for over 20 years. So regardless of the approach that we take, whether it be a conventional or an engineered approach for phytoremediation, there's a couple hard, fast rules that must be honored if this is to be anything but failure. The first is your plants must thrive under site conditions. So you have to pick the right plant species for the right site to understand the climatic conditions, the role that contamination may play, etc. Your phytoremediation system must utilize the targeted contaminated media. In other words, they must root down, if it's a groundwater site, they must root down and start to exert some influence on that impacted groundwater, or they're simply not going to have any benefit. Your phytosystem must create a remedial effect. Again, if you plant trees and they never root down to your target groundwater, you may have healthy, thriving trees, but they're not bringing about any of the remedial effect you desire. And lastly, and this is an important one, you must be sure or certain that the fate of the contaminants doesn't create additional problems. An example of this is accumulation of certain contaminants within the plant tissues. PFAS, for example, some of the metals that may be taken up can increase and accumulate within plant tissues to the point where they create an eco risk or even a risk to humans. PFAS is accumulating in plants everywhere, including some of the crops that we may be eating, like lettuce. There's been a lot of press about that in recent years. So plants can certainly take up certain contamination and accumulate it within their tissues. That can create extra burden. So we want to make sure that we're achieving these key goals for the phytoremediation system to be successful. So then let me turn my focus first to traditional phytoremediation. So these are traditional plantings, that is typically surface plantings of trees or other plants for soil phytoremediation often, in some cases also for groundwater if it's shallow. A key mechanism here is typically soil rhizodegradation. Again, that's the degradation or breakdown of contaminants, especially organic pollutants, within the root zone. Oftentimes we're looking at applied things like this for petroleum hydrocarbon impacted sites where shallow soils, there may have been an above ground storage tank that released fuel. Phytoremediation can be very effective as those trees root through that contaminated soil and potentially root down to groundwater to exert and influence a remedial benefit for both of those media. So this is the approach that is typically taken for sites where your contamination is near to the surface and critically it's accessible to your plant roots. We can also apply this for groundwater applications. So if you have a relatively shallow groundwater unit, water-bearing zone, say generally, I'd say within 10 feet of ground surface is a good rule of thumb to work with. Then we can either dig a shallow hole or even auger a shallow planting hole, maybe 6 or 8 inch diameter hole drilled down a couple feet. We can plant a tree in that and have it root down through the native soil towards our target groundwater to eventually develop a hydraulic connection between the plant root and the target groundwater to begin to exert a remedial benefit. So now that you have a kind of a sense for how we go about applying traditional phyto, let me give you a case study. I recognize this is an environmental professional group from Idaho. It can get chilly up there. So I thought I'd mention right out the gate, one of our old sites in northern Wisconsin, also a pretty chilly place. This is a petroleum hydrocarbon site. So some quick background, this was a former truck fleet maintenance yard, where as part of a property transfer, the due diligence assessment identified that about a quarter acre of the site had polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon contamination within the shallow soil. Those PAH concentrations exceeded the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources risk levels for direct contact. And so that triggered the need to do some type of remediation here. Certainly dig and haul was considered, but nobody wants to do that. It's costly. You're simply moving the contamination from one place to the other. And so we quickly identified that, hey, phytoremediation might be an effective approach here. And that was very much desired to find an effective and low cost remedy here. So in 2015, we implemented phytoremediation. We reached out to a local grass seed distributor, and came up with a mixture of native grass and forb seeds that we could then apply to that quarter acre site for fast growth to promote, ultimately to promote PAH degradation within the root zone. One of the benefits of using grasses and forbs is they tend to have very dense and very fibrous root networks, very dense networks of roots within the first few feet of the soil profile. That readily promotes pH and petroleum hydrocarbon degradation within that rhizosphere, again, that area around the roots. We did have to do some initial irrigation to get the system established, but once it was established, rainfall was sufficient to keep the system going. We did periodically mow to remove weeds. And so that was planted in the spring of 2015. By the fall of 2016, we went out and collected some confirmation samples to compare to the initial baseline. How much remediation did we achieve over those 2 growing seasons? And I'm pleased to say that within 2 growing seasons, the overall reduction in PAH concentrations was sufficient to meet the performance requirements that had been set out by Wisconsin DNR. As a result, that agency granted us full site closure after only 2 growing seasons. I think that really speaks to how quickly this approach can be effective and can close the site. Only 2 growing seasons, and of course we saved a tremendous amount of money for the client as opposed to some much more costly remedial alternatives. Petroleum hydrocarbons, I keep mentioning that, especially for these soil sites, because phytoremediation aligns so well. I just want to briefly mention one of my colleagues, before he joined us about 5 years ago, Trevor Carlson, spent 20 years applying phytoremediation at 7 different sites in central Canada. Some of these sites very, very highly impacted by petroleum hydrocarbons, especially gas and diesel range, both within soil and groundwater. In some cases, groundwater deeper than 30 feet. Phytoremediation programs that he implemented consisted of the use of native willows, poplars, as well as some hybrid poplars. Typically, these are fast-growing, deep-rooting tree species that can really do well in central Canada, as well as much of the U.S. The learnings from all those implementations show that this could be a very effective system, even in very cold climates like central Canada, even for highly contaminated sites. They would over time see greater than 99% reduction in most of the petroleum hydrocarbons they were analyzing for. So for those who think that phyto can't be successful in cold climates, I hope to lay that myth to rest. It's just not the case. It just may take a little more time, but we can be very effective with it. And one last traditional or conventional phyto project, one near and dear to me. I live in the Bay Area of California, so this is a site not too far from me here in Central California. This was a former agricultural chemical distribution facility. It's been closed for about 25 years. And about 21 years ago, a phyto system was installed to address a number of contaminants here. So it's a suite of contaminants, primarily nitrate by mass, nitrate fertilizer, but as well we have diesel range, petroleum hydrocarbons, and a whole array of herbicides, everything from Dynaseb to soil fumigants like 1,2-dichloropropane and 1,2,3-trichloropropane. So a wide array of contaminants here in both soil and groundwater. Groundwater at this site typically occurs somewhere between 9 and 12 feet below ground surface. So 2003, about 20 years ago, a eucalyptus stand, about 2.5 acres of red gum eucalyptus was planted over the most affected portion of this site, where both soil contamination occurred and by connection, there was groundwater contamination as well. Key remedial goals then were contaminant treatment of the affected soils and groundwater, and critically, hydraulic control of the contaminant plume. There is a residential neighborhood just hydraulically down gradient of this site within 200 feet. And some of the contaminants to this site are volatile. So of course you have a vapor intrusion concern. So hydraulic control is a critical goal for this system. It has proven to be a very effective, over the longer term, very effective remedy. We see, because it is Central California and we do have milder winters here, and because eucalypts are almost all evergreens, so they do not shed their leaves. That is, they continue to grow and transpire year-round. So the result is we see year-round hydraulic control of the groundwater plume. So we prevent off-site migration. We've seen a very substantial reduction in contaminant mass, greater than 99% for a number of these contaminants, including the diesel range organics. Heck, we're removing somewhere between 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of nitrate each year from the subsurface with this system. And most of the contaminants overall, we are below the detection limits now, after 20 years of this system being in place. So you can see that a few of the photos here give you an illustration. These eucalypts are planted at typically about a 5-foot spacing within the 2.3 acres. That bottom image will show you that's simply a groundwater elevation map. You can clearly see the inward gradient that's flowing towards the phytoplantation and preventing the off-site migration of the contaminant plumes. So now that we've talked a little bit about traditional or conventional phyto, want to turn and look at something much more engineered and designed. This particular system is called the tree well system. It's a proprietary patented system. Gentleman that was really my mentor for almost 20 years, Dr. Ed Gestler, was the clever fellow who invented this idea and patented it many years ago. Sadly, Ed passed away 2 years ago from COVID, but we continue to use this system. It's really been quite effective. What we're looking at here is an engineered system that ultimately targets only the impacted groundwater. That's the only groundwater these trees can utilize. And that's because what we're doing here is we're using a large diameter drill rig, typically a 3 to 4 foot diameter auger, and we're drilling down to our target water bearing zone, whether that be at 10 feet, 50 feet, even potentially greater depth than that. Once we reach that target water bearing zone, we remove those soils. We're not going to reuse them. We then install a liner that literally lines the edge of that borehole. It's open at the bottom, it's open at the top. We then install downhole instrumentation like passive gas exchange tubing that you see there in yellow, piezometers to monitor groundwater elevation, even some fertilizer injection tubes. We then backfill with an imported agricultural grade soil up to surface. We plant the tree at the top of this unit, slightly above grade, and then critically, we'll take the rest of that liner and wrap it around the base of the tree. That eliminates meteoric water from entering this system. It forces that tree then to root downward towards the capillary fringe of our target groundwater unit. And so ultimately what we're looking to do here is achieve a hydraulic connection between our tree roots at surface and relatively deep groundwater. As I say, anywhere from 5 to 10 feet to as much as 50 feet plus. In fact, we have a number of sites where we've applied this system to address groundwater deeper than 100 feet below ground surface. And so just to give you a sense for how we install this photograph nicely sums it up. So you can see a caisson drill rig in the background there. It's advancing about a 4 foot diameter auger at this site to a depth of between 15 and 18 feet. This site we were going after a 1,4-dioxane plume that was within a fractured bedrock, a saprolite that was flowing down the slope from right to left. There's a creek over there on the left-hand side of this photo. We wanted to intercept that 1,4-dioxane plume before it made it to that creek. So we put in an array of these engineered tree well units. And so you can see the drill rig actively drilling down. Here in the middle of the photograph, you can see that safety platform. That was a hole that we had already constructed. So we're in the process now of backfilling it with imported topsoil. And finally, here in the foreground, you can see a freshly completed unit where you can see that liner that's exposed. You can see the aeration tubing and the piezometer and that soil. The only thing that awaits then is to plant the tree at the top of that, wrap that liner around the tree, and then we give it a nice thick coating of gravel to protect and insulate that mound. And so you can see those are some freshly planted willows and some sycamores there in these photographs. If you're wondering what those yellow things are, those are for deer and beaver damage, to keep any beaver that might be over there near that creek away from our trees. Those are my arch enemies, those beavers. And that's what that system looked like 5 years later. We had sycamore and willows that were easily 20 feet after 5 years. And that was a very effective system. So some of the key benefits of taking this approach, it allows us to target a very wide range of contaminants, both organic, inorganic, and even some contaminants of emerging concern, especially 1,4-dioxane. Critically, one of the benefits of this approach, and you can see this in the figure on the left, we have both an oxidizing and a reducing zone within the same unit. So where the roots are within the vadose, a very oxidizing zone. Remember, we've got that passive aeration tubing there to get oxygen into the root zone and other undesirable gases or volatiles out. Conversely, below the water line, before the elevation of water, we have strongly reducing conditions. We're actually putting quite a bit of organic material in there to drive to reducing conditions. So it can be a really effective way to go after, say, chlorinated solvents like PCE, where we're getting initial degradation within the reducing zone. And as they carried up, they're transformed to less chlorinated, like DCE and vinyl chloride, where they can readily be degraded within the vadose or oxidizing zone. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch, and really an elegant way to go after chlorinated solvents, and to some degree, petroleum hydrocarbons as well. Again, much like conventional phyto, we have an active rhizosphere community here that's really contributing mightily to the degradation of a lot of the organic contaminants we're targeting. So this system optimizes growing conditions. It helps to reduce phytotoxicity due to high contaminant concentrations. It's very adaptable. We can tailor this to specific site pollutants or site conditions. Ultimately, this is active treatment, but it's delivered in a passive manner. And for that reason, this can be a really great alternative to or a direct replacement for costly pump and treat systems. And we're actively doing that. And I'll note that this has actually been recognized by US EPA as a green and sustainable technology. Before I jump into a few case studies, why use this engineered approach? I mean, I spent the first portion of this talk discussing traditional phyto. Well, there's some obvious limits to traditional phytoremediation. One is your target groundwater may simply be too deep. If it's greater than 10 feet, you may have a hard time getting plant roots down to that depth. Your site soils may be too poor or too compacted, or the contamination concentrations could simply be too high. And then lastly, there's the confounding issue of plants being efficient systems. They'll often rely on meteoric water, a precipitation that's stored in the first couple of feet of the soil profile, and they won't root down to your target groundwater at depth if they're getting all their moisture satisfied by rain. So we contrast this with an engineered approach like this tree well system, where we are managing every aspect of the plant's growth except for the climate itself, and directly targeting the zone for remedial effect. I mentioned this already. Multiple sites we've applied this technology for groundwater plumes at greater than 50 feet below ground surface. If we can construct these systems, we can target even very deep groundwater. We can treat very highly contaminated aquifers with this technology. We typically see, when we design these systems correctly, we typically see hydraulic control achieved within the first 3 to 4 growing seasons. And critically, it allows these trees to thrive even under some really adverse conditions. And for any phytoremediation system to be successful, you need to have healthy, thriving plants. So let me jump into a quick case study or two. First one, I recognize you folks are in Idaho, but the key takeaways apply anywhere really in North America here. So this is a site in Central Florida. This is a former manufacturing facility, electronics manufacturer. The issues here are chlorinated solvents and critically 1,4-dioxane. There was also some naturally occurring arsenic, all in groundwater within a fractured bedrock aquifer at about 10 to 15 feet below ground surface. Initially, the client had a very costly long-term pump and treat system here, $300,000 to $350,000 per year in O&M costs, and it was struggling mightily to control the plume. And it was predicted at the time we got involved in 2012, it was predicted to take more than 25 years to meet the remedial goal of simply switching to MNA for this site. So it was a really expensive and poorly performing system. So in 2012, we did a focused feasibility study. As a result of that, we went with phyto. Some initial groundwater modeling that I'll discuss in a minute identified that about 150 engineered tree well units could be planted. So that's what we did in 2013. We planted 4 native wetland species. That actually helped to expedite the permitting. The regulators really liked that we were removing non-native Brazilian pepper from this site and planting native wetland plants. Money matters here. I always like to point this out. The cost to implement this system was about the same as just 1 year O&M for the old pump and treat system. And what were the results then? We demonstrated hydraulic capture by the end of 2014, just after 18 months, we had already achieved hydraulic control, and that allowed us to idle and eventually abandon the old pump and treat system. And we've seen very significant decreases in groundwater concentrations. So I love this photo top left here. It just so nicely illustrates how rapidly we can achieve hydraulic control when we directly target the groundwater plume. So what you're seeing is here, the arrows in yellow indicate the groundwater flow condition at the time we first implemented the phyto system. Now, at that time, their old pump and treat was still running. And as you can see, they continue to have off-site migration of the 1,4-dioxane plume away from the source area that's in the top right of that photo towards the residential community. And that was what really triggered a very unhappy regulator. Contrast that to the arrows in blue. After only 18 months, we had already reversed the gradient. We had an inward flow towards the phyto system in only 2 growing seasons. And I'll note that our experience at this site, particularly with groundwater modeling, has been applied to other sites with great success. And I'm going to speak on that a little bit more. So we had good results on hydraulic control. What about contaminant concentrations? Well, just 2 monitoring wells that nicely illustrate here. So bottom left, MW10 is within the planting area. Now, in both of these graphs, the red arrow indicates the time that we installed the phyto system. As you can see, when we installed it, we saw a very rapid decrease within the plantation itself to ultimately to below detection limit. Now, this second monitoring well 24R, was outside of the planting area between the phytoplantation and the source area. It took a little bit longer, but we saw the same effect there. Ultimately, concentrations decreased to the point where they were consistently non-detected. So great news on hydraulic control, great news on contaminant degradation. And I want to just quickly mention, I know some folks aren't big believers in groundwater modeling, but gosh, we've really got a crew here at Geosyntec that's just really nailed down how to perform accurate, predictive groundwater modeling for these engineered phytosystems. And I want to speak on that real quickly. So what you're seeing here is what the groundwater model predicted would be the flow conditions before we installed the system in red versus the real flow conditions shown in blue after 18 months. Just as the groundwater model predicted, we had a strong inward gradient established after just 2 growing seasons. If we move a little bit further ahead in time to spring of 2016, that effect is even stronger. Just as the model predicted, we had a strong inward gradient, and that was just really confirmed for us that it's a huge advantage of taking this approach, because we can do accurate predictive groundwater modeling. That way we know exactly how many of these engineered phyto units to put at the site to achieve our goals. And we're applying that now to multiple other sites. I think I'm still good on time, so I'll jump into one more case study. So to close this one out, to sum it up, we took an ineffective and very costly pump and treat system and basically replaced it with 154 trees. And the result was very significant savings to the client, a very happy regulator. We really turned that situation around. And the good news, we got a no further action granted in 2016, and in 2019, full site closure. So we are done with this site. It has been completely remediated. If the client elected to, they could remove these trees, but they've decided to allow it just go wild now that the site's clean, because there is a wildlife restoration, a wildlife habitat restoration component to this, and they really like that. So one last case study. This was a site in southern Illinois. This was another former manufacturing facility as refrigerants at this site, a substantial carbon tetrachloride plume with DNAPL. Now, they at this site, the client did have an existing pump and treat system that was very ineffective, quite expensive. It really struggled to perform. It required batch operation. That is, they had to turn the pump system on until the wells dewatered, then turn it off and allow it to recover. So it was really struggling. Some of that's attributed to the tight glacial till soils that were encountered at this site. If you're familiar with glacial tills, they're very low hydraulic conductivity. They can really be a beast to target effectively, to remediate effectively. And so in 2015, we installed an engineered phytoremediation system. I'm already giving away the good news here. Illinois EPA approved then disabling the pump and treat system in 2016. It's been abandoned. So we actually took a 2-pronged approach here to go after that source area. Again, we had DNAPL carbon tetrachloride here. We knew we had to be a little bit urgent because this was an active rail line. They were actually in the process of selling this plant, and there's an active rail line there. So they wanted to quickly target the source area. So we did that with electrical resistive heating, but they had a substantial down gradient plume that was migrating towards the property boundary. How do we stop that? Well, we did that with the engineered phytoremediation system, those tree well units. So a two-pronged approach here. And the effectiveness of the tree well system allowed us to eventually disable and remove the pump and treat. So again, groundwater modeling. We did some initial groundwater monitoring on this site, modeling on this site. And based upon that, we put in a pilot study in 2015 of 51 tree well units. We did further groundwater modeling and identified that a full-scale system would benefit by another 28 units that were installed in 2017. And what we've seen, much like the Florida site, is an excellent correlation between what the groundwater model predicted and actual groundwater flow conditions. So here's a comparison then of groundwater flow conditions before we put in the phytosystem versus after. So spring of 2014, a year before we put in the phytosystem, the pump and treat system was maintaining source control right there at the source, but it was having no effect on the drown gradient plume that was migrating away from the site. We compare that then to 2017. After 3 growing seasons, we had a very clear inward gradient to the phytoplantations that you see in yellow there, the various components of it. So that is then what allowed us to shut off that pump and treat system, clear evidence that we had hydraulic control. Wintertime, this is probably the most common question I get asked. Okay, Ron, that's great. You're showing us a site in Florida or California, but what happens in the wintertime, especially in colder places like Idaho? Well, I think this speaks to this point that phytoremediation can be very effective even in cold climates when we design the system properly. Even at this site in Illinois, we observed in February that we still had an inward gradient towards these trees. Now we do have milder winter days in Illinois, where it's maybe above 40 degrees, and we did include some conifers at this site. So of course, conifers are evergreens. So on a mild winter day, they're going to continue to transpire. And the result was we continued to see an inward gradient even in February. So I'm happy to discuss this on the questions portion of this presentation, but we can overcome winter dormancy. It's simply about how you design the system. So then, a quick comparison of the phytosystem versus the old pump and treat. The old pump and treat struggled to pump about 100,000 gallons per year, whereas our phytosystem, is pumping conservatively at least 1 million gallons per year. The former system was 5 struggling extraction wells that were really showing no influence whatsoever on the down gradient plume, whereas we put in 79 engineered phytoremediation units that quickly established complete hydraulic control of the down gradient plume. Cost savings, it was averaging about $75,000 a year in O&M costs for the old pump and treat system, whereas during our first couple of years of establishment, we averaged about $22,000 for the phytosystem. Now it's about zero. Essentially, once the system's established, we're doing nothing. So basically, we replaced an ineffective pump and treat system with our 79 trees. And I'll note some of those trees have exhibited tremendous tolerance to even phase material. When we were installing these trees, you see the image on the top right. While we were drilling one of those units, we actually encountered some very heavy concentration. And subsequently, when we were sampling one of the piezometers in one of those tree well units, we actually pulled out phase carbon tetrachloride, and yet the trees are thriving. You can see these photos were just a couple years after implementation. Some of those poplars are greater than 20 feet in the height. So then we obtained hydraulic control of the plume in just 2 growing seasons. That allowed us to shut down and eventually abandon the pump and treat system, and we've had really enthusiastic response and endorsement by Illinois EPA. So now that we've completed the source area remediation, our remedial goals have been met, and we are awaiting conditional closure for this site. The phytosystem will remain in place as a passive hydraulic control remedy as part of that conditional closure. So some takeaways then from all this. Whether we're applying conventional, or that is traditional phytosystems, or engineered approaches, phytoremediation can be very effective when you properly characterize the site from a phytoremediation perspective, when your impacted media, whether that be soil or groundwater or both, are accessible to plant roots, where your expectations are reasonable, that are for all stakeholders, including regulators and clients, where that accounts for the time frame to meet your cleanup. There are going to be some site prep requirements, and there is maintenance requirements. We may need to fertilize, we may need to do some supplemental irrigation to get the tree's established, you may have to do some weed management early on. But once the trees are established, that largely goes away. I say this many times, work with the experts, because we've already made the mistakes. In my 20 plus years in this business, I've made a few mistakes, and a lot of mistakes can be made here. So work with people who've done this before, so that you can be sure that you're properly designing, implementing, and managing your phyto system. We here at Geosyntec have more than 100 years of combined real-world phytoremediation experience across North America. Phytoremediation, revegetation of impacted soils, especially by petroleum hydrocarbons, stormwater systems that utilize phytotechnologies like bioswales and rain gardens, and of course carbon sequestration. So we'd be happy to help anyone on the call who might be interested. And with that, I will thank you for your time, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Gosh, thanks, Ron. That was super interesting.
Well, thank you.
That was really great. Just open up to the group. Does anybody want to start with questions? I'll start with one. I'm curious if where you're seeing kind of implementation in this stuff is, forever chemicals is a hot buzzword right now. Are you starting to see interest in this around airports or Air Force installations, things like that?
Carrie, was it PFAS that you're mentioning?
The PFAS, PFOA, the forever chemicals. Sorry.
We've dug hard into this. We're specifically looking for funding to do some pilot studies where we would combine one of these, some number of these engineered phytoremediation units with an absorbent technology, probably GAC, granular activated carbon, where we would simply use the tree as a pump. Mm-hmm. And use that pump to pull PFAS-laden groundwater or a PFAS plume through a GAC zone that would be installed within that engineered phyto unit. We could design it so that we know we'd conservatively have 20 or 30 years of life out of it. And so it would be a passive GAC system. It would be a passive pump and treat system, essentially, right? With a GAC technology. We're all over that. I'd very much like to see that come to bear. We thought we had a site down in Florida. It was an old state-run fire training facility, but we just couldn't get all the ducks in a row to make it happen. But we'd love to see it go about. So yeah, we're all over the PFAS thing. I will say, I cringe even as I say this. There's some consultant somewhere who patented the use of plants to directly take up PFAS compounds. I don't know why on earth you'd want to patent that. That is a problem that you want to avoid at all costs. You now have PFAS compounds accumulating within the foliar tissue of your plant. You, by definition, created an ecological risk there. I don't know why anyone would do that, but well, what can I say? Not a good idea.
I know, it just seems like a no-brainer to plant around these plumes and do something like that, though.
Right.
These tree wells, so.
Especially if it's a shallow plume, where you're looking at a costly, you'll never turn off kind of pump and treat system. I think it could be a really elegant approach. Mm-hmm. So we're hoping that at some point we'll get somebody to bite at that. We're still looking for funding for that.
We understand the struggle.
This is Laura. What you just referenced it, but what is, sort of the bioaccumulation, if you will? How does that factor in, and considerations with like disposal of plants or when they die, or how does that all work?
Laura, are you talking about PFAS or just are you talking PFAS specifically or other types of pollutants in general?
With any phytoremediation.
So Laura, anytime I'm presented a site, I'm always going to ask myself that question. What is the fate of the contaminant or contaminants in a plant-based remediation system? If it's a petroleum hydrocarbon, if it's chlorinated, I can go on and on. If it's a nutrients, nitrate, ammonia, sulfate, it's slam dunk. There is no issue there. But there is a subset of contaminants where we need to be very concerned about that. Willows, for example, will readily take up cadmium because they confuse it for zinc. zinc is an essential plant nutrient. Cadmium is not, but the cadmium can bind to the zinc receptor, and you wind up with potentially some substantial concentrations of cadmium within your plant tissues. Then you get to things like PFAS, or another good example is perchlorate. We have a client that has a large perchlorate plume that's migrating down towards a river, and they have tamarisk, that is salt cedar, down there, right along the edge of the river. There's no doubt those tamarisks are in hydraulic connection with the perchlorate plume. There's no doubt that there's perchlorate within the plant leaves, because it doesn't get broken down by the plant, but it will get readily taken up and accumulate within the leaves. So you're essentially translocating your contaminant from the subsurface into the leaves. Now, if you know that that's going to happen and it's not killing the tree, then yeah, you do have the potential to harvest those leaves and dispose of them appropriately. You can have them tested. What is the contaminant concentration? And you can dispose of them properly. So it doesn't have to be a deal breaker, but if you know that's what's going to happen, you need to manage that and prevent that eco risk from occurring. So if that means you have to keep birds and insects off, then you're going to have a game plan for how you're going to do that. But I will say metals, again, are another one where, you know, metal contaminated soils, you often see things like mustards being planted because a number of metal hyperaccumulator plants occur within the mustard family. Well, and in that case, you know that at the end of each growing season, you're going to be harvesting that plant and disposing of it as likely as has waste. So it's all about knowing what the fate is and managing appropriately. So it doesn't have to be a problem unless you allow it to be a problem.
Thanks, that's interesting.
Hi, Ron, this is Chris.
Hi, Chris.
With obviously each site is going to be different, but you mentioned in Florida utilizing native plants and those sorts of things. So how do you balance a plant's effectiveness for treating any type of contaminant versus utilizing native plants? And then if you're going to utilize a non-native plant that could be invasive, how do you balance all that? And then I guess the follow-up question would be, have you done any locations kind of in semi-arid or mountain deserts or those types of things?
So first question, yeah, it is a balancing act. I can tell you, right now I'm struggling with the site in the deep south where a former colleague planted trees that he shouldn't have planted. They're just outside of their happy zone. In plant speak, we say outside of their hardiness zone. The result is trees that should be doing great are really struggling from the extreme heat, harsh summers of the deep south. They're not native to this area, but they were used anyway. They shouldn't have been. So my preference, Chris, is always, when I can, to use native species. They're adapted to those climatic conditions. They're best suited overall. There may be some particulars that force me to look at other options. For example, hybrid poplars. Hybrid poplars tend to be the go-to plants for groundwater phytoremediation because they're very fast growing, deep rooting. They can more quickly bring about the remedial effects we desire. Well, that's fine if that particular hybrid does well in my particular site's area. If it doesn't, I shouldn't be using it. So there's a judgment call that's often applied here. And I always want to defer, though, to native plants when I can and not bring in something exotic. It just opens the door to all kinds of problems. I could go on and on with this. I have a site that I'm involved with in Houston, Texas, where another consultant chose to put in eucalyptus, 5 acres of eucalyptus as a phytoremediation system 20 years ago. Well, 20 years ago wasn't the climate we have today. And we get these freak polar vortex events where suddenly Houston, Texas is 10 degrees. It slaughtered those poor eucalypts. After 20 years of great growth, they got slaughtered by those devastating freeze damage. It killed every single one of them. It's heartbreaking. So you really have to use some good judgment and experience, Chris. And the second part of your question I think you said desert and mountain areas, is that right?
Yeah, high mountain desert areas, you could even think even Central California, Southern California, or because we have similar mountain desert
Right.
climatic conditions.
Again, that's where I'm looking to native species. I've got one of my old sites in Central California where we're actually using desert phreatophytes because they're very tolerant to high salts and alkaline conditions. We're actually using them at a site that has high salt and alkaline conditions in Central California. It's been a wonderful fit. So again, just because it's in a mountainous or desert area doesn't mean there's not plants that we can look to. There's a lot of good plants that we can go to. We just need to have a good understanding and understand what the implications of using a particular plant will be in terms of how effective the system will be and how much time it will take to meet our remedial goals. You know, if you plant a small plant, it's not going to move as much groundwater as a large tree, right? So you have to have that understanding going in. But in almost every case, there's a palette of plants that we can pick some good candidates out of.
You briefly mentioned conifers at one point. You have success, so it's not just the deciduous trees.
Oh yeah. We have a number of systems where we're using conifers to great success. Again, because almost every single conifer is an evergreen. That is, it doesn't shed its leaves. It has the benefit on milder winter days or milder climates like where I'm at in the Bay Area. Absolutely, we can plant conifers. That's why we've got those eucalypts. That one side that I presented. Now they're not conifers, but they're evergreen plants, evergreen trees. So year-round transpiration. That's a big benefit if you desire to see hydraulic control, right? We're never going to lose hydraulic control if we design the system properly and use evergreens.
I've worked on projects where we needed to take out the ukes because they had too much influence on some nearby creeks.
Yeah. Well, California has a somewhat tortured history of eucalypts. They're not native to this country, of course. Yeah. They're native to Australia, and they are somewhat controversial. But to be clear, eucalyptus is everywhere in California. It is very naturalized. So, we certainly don't want to encourage it growing in areas where there's native oaks, for example. But they're doing a great job at this site, and they're growing wild all around the site. So, that's another judgment call.
Yep. Well, this was great. Yeah, we're right on time. Gosh, Ron, thank you so much. We will.
My pleasure.
Get this up for our members, and so it will be in our member-only content recorded. I just really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for attending today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. Thank you, everyone.